Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our program tonight from Stephanie Johnson. We're looking forward to hearing what she has to say. I'm Bruce Wingus, president of Photo Society. Just a couple of things to share before we get going here. Our fall workshop with Sampariti, we have still about 4 openings in that. The deadline for the early bird special is June 5th. So if you want to sign up for that, you can do that. If you want to sign up later, we'll take more of your money. Let's see, on June 19th, we have a Zoom presentation with our next program with Jerry Dottrell. I think I'm saying his name correctly. He's going to talk about how to make prints from your photos. And then on July 17, we have our annual Pechakucha program coming up. So if you want to start getting your photos together, 20 photos in 20 seconds, and be happy to ship. That's about it. We don't have another photo walk until July. So now I'm going to turn this over to Jean, who's going to introduce our speaker.
My pleasure. Our guest this evening is Stephanie Johnson. She has a Bachelor of Arts degree, graduate work in English literature, and has always had a very strong emotional connection to art in all its various forms. Her photographic journey started when she bought her first film SLR camera and began creating traditional images of the spectacular sunsets over the East China Sea. From there, she moved on to immersing herself with the camera in the desert landscapes of Southern California before another move brought her to Iowa. Stephanie is now primarily focused on ICM and creative photography techniques as a form of artistic expression. She is founder, creator, and publisher of ICM Photography Magazine, a first of its kind e-magazine dedicated solely to ICM photography. Plus, she leads many on-location ICM workshops in the US, the UK, and she also is an instructor for Santa Fe workshops. Stephanie says that she brings an interconnected and intuitive approach to her photography as art to create not just frozen moments in time, but to visually express the essence of light, color, form, line, and texture. As such, her personal vision is one that integrates creativity in the field with ethical behavior toward the natural environment. Throughout tonight's presentation, members may put questions in the chat. Stephanie will watch that and answer them as we go along, or you can save them until the end. I'm sure we will be inspired to see things differently with your encouragement and your ICM teaching tonight, Stephanie. You can begin whenever you're ready.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much, Jean, and thank you for the invitation to talk about intentional camera movement with the, how do you say it, Cuyahoga? Is that right?
Cuyahoga?
Cuyahoga, okay. I didn't say it right. I'm very happy to be here. And as Jean mentioned, I have been primarily focused on intentional camera movement for several years now, and it is my passion. And so I love to teach it. I love to encourage others to see the world differently through the use of camera movement and creative techniques with their cameras. So we'll get right into this presentation. I began doing ICM in about 2017, and as Jean mentioned, I started out as a traditional landscape photographer back in the 90s, but over the years I was never able to really dedicate a lot of time to my creative desires or creative pursuits for various different reasons. But in 2015, things changed a little bit for me, and I was able to get back into photography in a much more immersive way, I guess you could say. And I started traveling to Ireland, and I was going to Ireland about every 2 to 3 months and traveled there 8 times over the next 2.5 years just to go shoot the traditional landscapes in Ireland. But every time I'd come back to Iowa, I would have a hard time getting out with my camera. And I started seeing ICM in 2017 for the first time, although it has been around for many, many years. Ernst Haas was doing ICM back in the 50s and 60s. Freeman Patterson has been doing ICM. He's a Canadian photographer. He's been doing ICM for 40 or 50 years. Michael Orton, some of you may know of the Orton effect. He's been doing ICM for many, many years as well. So ICM is not a new thing, but it does seem as though it's been getting a lot more attention, and people are becoming a lot more interested in it just in the past few years. But even in 2017, when I first started working with it, and then eventually by about early 2018, I was fully dedicated to doing ICM, and I don't shoot traditional landscapes or traditional photography anymore, unless it is just to create kind of a before shot, or a shot that I can show a before and an after. And oftentimes those before shots are actually created with just my mobile device. So in 2017, when I first started working with ICM, there weren't a lot of tutorials. There weren't a lot of videos or YouTube, videos or things like that out there. So I just essentially got out, started moving the camera, and started learning and teaching myself. And so I do believe that practical application is the best way to learn anything, really. But certainly with ICM, it's very helpful to just get out and start moving. And I also read a book in that particular time frame, 2017, by another Canadian photographer, David Duchemin, called A Beautiful Anarchy. And in that book, he talks a lot about doing the work. You have to get out and do the work, and it's in the doing of the work that inspiration comes. And so I took that, and it became kind of my own mantra, do the work. And I took that idea of just getting out into my local landscape and moving the camera and doing a lot of work, just playing and exploring and experimenting. And I have shot more prolifically within about 30 miles of where I live over the years than I have anywhere else, by just getting out and immersing myself in the local landscape and seeing it differently. And then the other thing I was gonna just say that I lost the thought came in my head and then I lost it. It'll come back to me, but the connection. So, I mentioned that I'd been traveling to Ireland, and I felt really connected to the Irish landscape. But then when I would come back, I found myself having a hard time feeling that same kind of connection in the Iowa landscape. But getting out and playing and seeing the Iowa landscape differently through moving my camera really helped me connect to the Iowa landscape, because you can really go to the same locations and just immerse yourself in the same locations over and over and over again. And so that really helped me make a more meaningful connection to my local environment. So in this presentation, I want to talk about single exposure ICMs, multiple exposure ICMs, and mobile ICMs. Those are the ways that I work with my camera to create with ICM. And so those are the things I want to talk about. As an introduction to ICM, ICM is a technique. It's a way of using the camera, but for me, it's more than just a technique. It's a creative process. It's a form of artistic expression. It's how I express myself artistically using my camera and using the tool of ICM in a creative way. I think ICM really does ask us to let go of a lot of the things we've previously learned about photography, like rules and perfectionism and sharpness, and the idea that there's a right or a wrong way to do anything, because especially with ICM, there really is no right or wrong way. It's very individual, and whatever works for you is right for you, but that might not necessarily be what works for someone else. So the only way you really can understand what is right for you in terms of how to move the camera, what the settings are, and things like that, is just by getting out and doing a lot of the work. And I feel like with time and loads of work, you can really learn to refine your processes and to see the potential in any given scene or situation, and just responding to things like the way the light's falling on a particular scene or something that catches your attention, playing with that and seeing things differently. And so ICM is a very intentional process of using camera movement during the exposure of an image. And it involves using slower shutter speeds. I generally recommend starting at about 1/10 of a second or slower. If you've never done ICM, I feel like 1/10 of a second is a good starting point. But the best way to find out what's going to work for you is just to experiment. Try maybe a little bit faster shutter speed or a little bit slower shutter speed, because again, there's no right or wrong way to do it. The first 3 years I was doing ICM, I was shooting at 1/13 of a second. Now I shoot at about a half a second. So over time, my own processes have evolved in terms of the shutter speed that I use. And it's more than just accidental camera shake. It's a very intentional and deliberate act of creation. And certainly there is some randomness to ICM, and there is a little bit of a lack of predictability in a lot of cases. There's no formulaic approach with ICM, but it is still an intentional and deliberate act of moving the camera to create artistic images. So it is more than just accidentally moving the camera. Some things to keep in mind, and I did want to mention too that I have given Jean a link to a Google Drive folder that contains this presentation as a PDF download. So after the talk tonight, you will be able to download this presentation if you'd like to keep it for future reference. And again, also, if you do have questions and you want to pop them in the chat, I'll keep an eye on that as well. I really feel like controlling the shutter speed is more important than controlling the aperture, but everybody works differently, and there are ICM photographers out there who work by controlling their aperture. For me, what I want to control is my shutter speed. I want to know with every shot that I take what my shutter speed is going to be. And so if I've got the camera in aperture priority, where the camera is controlling the shutter speed based on the aperture I have it set to, I may not know what that shutter speed is going to be. And so I shoot in manual mode myself, but I do feel like if you're not comfortable shooting in manual mode, shutter priority would be the next best option, so that you are controlling the shutter speed and you know that every shot you take, you're going to be at 1/10 of a second or half a second or whatever it is that you set your shutter speed to be controlled at. But again, trying different things is always really important, because maybe aperture is important to you. I don't really care necessarily what the aperture is. So I regularly shoot at f/32 if it's really bright out and I need an f/32 aperture to get a half a second shutter speed. So I'm adjusting my own aperture, ISO, and all of those things to get the shutter speed that I want to work with. And experimenting with different focal lengths is really important also, because to get the same effect, to achieve the same effect, moving the camera at 24 millimeters may require you to move it differently to achieve the same effect that you would then how you'd need to move the camera at 200 millimeters. With a wider focal length like 24 millimeters, you might have to move the camera a lot more depending on what it is you're trying to achieve than you would at 200 millimeters to achieve the same effect. So understanding how the different focal lengths affect the end result is really important. And then different sizes and speeds of movement also will create different kinds of effects. And we'll talk about all of these things as we go through the slides. And again, just keep in mind that there's no right or wrong way to do ICM. These are some of the kinds of movements that you could use. And I'm not going to go over this slide in depth because I'm going to talk about all of these different movements as we go through the different slides and look at some images. But I also have on this next slide a video that shows how I work with my camera out in the field. It's a short 2.5-minute video just with some music in the background that will show you how I'm working with my camera, how I hold it, how I move it, the different kinds of movements that I use, and not to say that these are the only kinds of movements that I might use. And that list, you can study it if you download the PDF. But again, I always like to say that if you can think of a way to move the camera, try it and see what happens, because you're really only limited by your own imagination. And so you might come up with a movement that nobody else has ever thought of before. And that's something that I try to do myself, because I always want to be pushing the boundaries with my work and always trying to do some new things that I haven't done before, or trying to create images that I haven't seen anyone else do before. And part of that is trying different things to see what different kinds of movements what the effects will be when I move the camera in different kinds of ways. And so I'm always looking for different ways to move the camera that I've never even thought of before. And it can be a little difficult to not keep doing the same thing, but just playing and experimenting and having fun is really important, I think. So we'll go ahead and watch this video, and hopefully it'll help show how I work with the camera, and then we'll talk about some images. So hopefully that was helpful to show how I work with the camera when I'm out in the field. And if you download the presentation and you open up the PDF, if you want to watch that video again, you can just click on this image in the PDF, and it'll open that video up on my YouTube channel. So you can watch that video again. So the first thing I want to talk about are single exposure ICMs. I think a lot of people are coming to ICM these days wanting to just jump right into doing multiple exposure ICMs, but I didn't start doing multiple exposures until about 2.5 years ago. So the first 5 years I was doing ICM, I was doing single exposure ICMs, and I feel like it's really helpful to have that as kind of the foundation of doing ICM, because if you do a lot of work as single exposures, you're going to understand how your camera works. You're going to understand how different sizes and speeds of movements and different settings are going to affect the end result. When you start to add in doing multiple exposure on top of that, that just adds a layer of complexity that might make it a little more difficult to really get to grips with ICM. So I do always recommend people start out with trying and playing and experimenting with single exposures, and that's certainly the way that I started. So these are some trees, and these are both using a vertical kind of movement. So basically moving the camera either from top to bottom or bottom to top. You can go either direction. And when I first started doing ICM, I actually started out with this compact point and shoot camera. I had a DSLR that I was using for my traditional landscape photography, but this was the camera. This little advanced compact point and shoot camera was the camera that got me out to start playing with camera movement in my local environment in Iowa. And so this image on the left is an image from that Canon G7X that I still love to this day. But eventually I did start doing all of my work with my DSLR until recently, probably the last couple of years, I've actually started doing mobile ICMs as well. And so, working with trees is a great place to start because it's easy to follow the lines of the trees. It's easy to, move vertically, but you don't have to move vertically with the trees or any subject that you might be working with. You don't have to follow the literal lines of those subjects. So in the video, you saw that I was doing a fast S-curve motion, something like this. And so that's the image on the right here. This image on the right is from that particular scene in that video, where I was doing a very fast S-curve motion. But the image on the left is a loose S-curve motion, a looser and wider S-curve motion. So size of movement and speed of movement are creating two different kinds of effects. With the slower, wider movement, you get looser lines, and with the very fast, tight S-curve motion, you get tighter lines. So again, playing with size and speed of movement is always really important. And then, of course, you don't have to do any kind of vertical motion at all with trees. You can just do a simple shaking or circular kind of motion like this. So shaking with a little bit of a circular motion is going to create a more impressionistic look and feel with the trees. But you can also do horizontal movement with trees. I don't have any horizontal ICMs of trees, but certainly you can do horizontal movement with trees as well. Try it and see what happens. Essentially, if you move the camera horizontally with trees, those trees start to become a little bit more ghostly, or they may disappear completely altogether. So this is a wavy motion. So something like this, a small waving motion. This is river rapids, and playing with the way the light is reflecting off of the water, and those rapids creates what looks and feels like waves of light flowing through the image here. These two images here are holding the camera vertically oriented and moving it horizontally, so going from left to right, or you could go from right to left. And then in these two images, I incorporate a bit of a twist. So I move horizontally and I twist the camera, which is creating some of that rotation that you see in these images. These are tall grasses, about 18 feet tall, and the tops of the grasses have feathery plumes, and the stalks of the grasses are usually in shadow. So that's creating creating this kind of effect that has some depth. It looks like it's got some visual depth because of those stalks being in shadows, and then the tops of those grasses helping to create that rotation that you see from the way the light's reflecting off of them. These are short grasses, so the image on the left is just grass hanging off over the side of a lake, on the bank of a lake. And what drew my attention was the way the light was reflecting off of those grasses, and then the way that contrasted really nicely with this dark, murky background of the lake behind it. So I'm always interested in contrast. That's something that always catches my attention, the contrast between highlights and shadows, or bright and dark, color, contrasts, things like that are things that always catch my attention. And both of these are using essentially a diagonal sort of movement. So moving the camera diagonally in one direction or another is also a way that you can move the camera. This is again using a twist, so horizontal with a twist, and this is a sunset over water. And because it's a sunset over water, I did get a little bit of color reflected in the lake, in the water. That's something that I always like. I do go out for sunset quite often, and I go to the same lake over and over and over again. I just often go to different parts of the lake depending on what part of the year it is and where the sun is going to set in relation to those different locations. But that's one of the beauties of ICM, is that you can go to the same locations over and over and over again, and you can always create something new and unique and different. This is using a wave motion, so up, down, and over, kind of an up, down, and over wave, working with that last bit of light before it's gone below the horizon. The sun has gone below the horizon. I often do shoot directly towards that bright light of the sun before it's gone below the horizon, or just after it's gone below the horizon. So I'm often having to underexpose a lot of times as well, and then bringing up some of the shadows maybe in post-processing, and bringing the highlights down in post-processing. But this created a really lovely yellow ribbon of light that flows across the frame that I really liked and enjoyed. This is the same field of wildflowers. And these two images show the difference between size and speed of movement again, and the shutter speed. The image on the left is a ½ second shutter speed. The image on the right is a much longer shutter speed, 3.2 seconds. So the image on the left is a loose shaking motion for ½ second, and the image on the right is a very fast, tight shaking motion for a much longer shutter speed, and that gives less recognizability of the subject. Same exact field of flowers, but with the loose shaking motion, you get the literal lines of those cone flowers. You know that there are cone flowers, and there's some yellow flowers in there. The image on the right, because of it being very tight shaking motion, it's creating a much more impressionistic feel and look to that scene. And you don't know what kind of flowers they are, but you can tell that it is a field of flowers. These two images are essentially working with some light leaks that were coming through in a fast-moving storm when I was out a couple of years ago. And I saw the sun, the way the light was coming through the clouds and all these little breaks in the sky. And I just thought, what can I do with that? I don't know what I can do with that. Let me see if I just start flipping the camera upside down. And so that's what I did. I just started doing this kind of a thing, flipping the camera upside down, pointing at those light leaks. And as I was doing that and seeing what was happening on the back of the camera, it felt like I was bending the light. These images felt like I was bending the light, because obviously the light's not coming through in that way necessarily, but that's what it felt like to me. And that's something that's always really exciting when you see something happening on the back of the camera that makes you excited about what you're creating. That's the beauty, I think, of ICM. This is a technique of hold the camera still for a fraction of that 1 second shutter speed. speed, and then a small wave off. This is also using a macro lens. So with a macro lens, you're probably not going to need to move the camera quite as much as you would maybe with a different type of lens. And so this is a tiny little, wildflower in a field of flowers, but using the macro lens, I was able to isolate this one flower and then just hold the camera still and wave off. Holding the camera still helps to imprint the literal lines of the flower, and then the wave off creates this, flow that feels like the flowers floating in air. These two images are using the zooming technique while hand holding, and you saw in the video that I was doing that. I'm moving the camera and zooming at the same time. These are both, leaves, autumn leaves, and pointing up at the different colored leaves where the light's coming through, and hand holding and waving the camera create these very wispy, wavy lines. Whereas if you're on a tripod and you do a zoom, you're going to get much straighter lines that are coming directly into a very pronounced center focal point, like this image here on the bottom. When you're waving the camera and zooming handheld, you still get those lines that are converging into a center focal point, but it's less pronounced than it would be if you were on a tripod. So it's fun to just play and get those wispy lines if you're, if you like that kind of thing. Some people, and early on, I did really like those very straight lines, and my early work was very linear because I do kind of have a linear brain, and coming into ICM, having those very straight lines was very appealing to me, but I've learned over time to loosen up and let go and to play, and so now I really do like the free flowing wispy wavy lines, and so try different things with the zooming technique also. This is another example of the same subject, two different movements creating two different effects. So this is both, these images are both this building on the University of Iowa campus, and the image on the left is just using that shaking kind of motion, so something like this, and the shaking motion renders a more impressionistic look and feel. You still see the literal lines of this building, whereas the image on the right is a very fast sweeping motion, so something like this. And the fast sweeping motion essentially blurs all of those lines of the building, and then the image becomes more about the layers of color or layers of texture or layers of light, things like that. So it's two different movements using the same subject to create completely different effect. So now I want to talk about multiple exposure ICM. And when I say multiple exposure ICM, I mean I'm moving the camera for each of the exposures of the ME sequence. And I am doing this work in the camera. My camera has the multiple exposure capability, and I have the ability to work with bright and dark blend mode. And those are the modes that I like to work with most. And so the ME sequence is taking the images in sequence, and then the camera is blending the image to create the multiple exposure. And so for this particular image, one exposure, I was doing a shaking motion, and you can see that represented in the lines of the leaves and things like that in the grasses in this image. And then one exposure was a vertical motion. So you can see how those two movements came together to create this image in multiple exposure in camera. And so I'll talk a little bit about average and additive blend mode and bright and dark blend mode as well. And so so that you have a little bit a better understanding. If you've never worked with the blending modes in your camera before, hopefully this will be helpful. If you are familiar with the blending modes in Photoshop, then you might already understand how things are getting the priority, or what things are coming through when you blend images together. And the camera is doing this in the camera, as opposed to, you know, taking two images and blending them in Photoshop. But the principle behind the blending mode is essentially the same. So with average and additive, it's really a layering on top of each other. So each of these exposures nothing is getting more priority than the other, anything else. So the camera is going to either average out the exposure, or it's going to add exposure when you're taking the images. You can see the lines of the horizontal ICM. You can see all of the lines of the vertical ICM to a certain degree of opacity, because with average and additive, essentially it's layering these images on top of each other. Whereas with bright blend mode, bright is what gets the priority across the two exposures, or however many exposures you might use. These happen to all be 2 exposures, and you can see how that plays out. So whatever's brightest across each of the exposures, that's what comes through in the final blended image. And so with bright blend mode, making sure that you're overlapping some dark areas helps to create some unusual kinds of effects. And something I like to do, and what I did do in this particular image, is I like to turn the camera upside down for the second exposure. So for this one, the first exposure was simply a vertical motion, and then I flipped the camera upside down. I can see a hint of that exposure I just took on my LCD screen, so I can be sure to line up some dark areas. And then the second exposure is a horizontal kind of wavy motion. You can see the lines of that. So turning the camera upside down when I'm in bright blend mode, especially for something like this, it's essentially bringing the sky into the top and the bottom of the frame. But with dark blend mode, the opposite happens. Dark gets the priority. So you can see these images. You can see in the top right corner of the first exposure, it's quite bright, especially compared to that top corner of the second exposure. So the darker part of the second exposure got the priority and came through, overriding that bright part of the first exposure. So understanding how bright and dark get the priority across the sequences is really important. But the ability to create some very, very artistic images is just really, really exponential, I think, when you're working with this multiple exposure technique in the camera. And so I have 2 different types of multiple exposure ICMs that I do, and I've called them these 2 different things. Type 1 being ME-ICM sequence. And what that means is I'm taking those images in sequence, like we just talked about, those 2 exposures or 3 exposures. Take one, take the next one, take the next one, and then the camera blends those together to make the multiple exposure. So that's a sequence. But then the other type that I like to talk about is this high frame rate or rapid fire ME-ICMs. And what that means is essentially I'm moving the camera rapidly around the scene. And I like to work with more exposures for this technique. So I might do, say, 9 exposures, and essentially it would be doing something like click, 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 click. I'm moving the camera. It's a little bit less controlled. It's a little bit more of a random approach compared to the more crafting that I do with the ME-ICM sequence, but it creates some really interesting effects in and of itself. So I'll talk a little bit about these 2 different types and show you some images. First, the ME-ICM sequences, where most of these are going to be 2 exposures where I've taken 1, 2 exposure, then the camera blends these together in the camera. This is an example of where I flipped the camera upside down to bring the sky into the top and the bottom of the frame. This is just some windows on the side of a church or a cathedral, an old historic cathedral, using dark blend mode to create a really painterly kind of effect here. And then the image here on the left is just an orange painted tree in a botanical garden. The image on the right is a hotel courtyard that had some very colorful painting on the walls and some different objects in the courtyard. So playing around with anything and everything, really, I think anything can be a potential subject when working with ICM. So don't limit yourself to thinking you have to only work with this particular subject or this particular kind of thing. Anything that catches your attention, I think, is something that you should stop and explore and play with. For this particular image, this is sunlight that's reflecting off of the top of grasses. It's the sunset, it's evening sunlight, so it's coming in from the side. What caught my attention was just the contrast between the way the sun was reflecting off of these grasses, but then these dark woods that were behind, this woodland area that was behind this field of grasses. And so playing around with these, one exposure is just a vertical wavy motion, and one exposure is a shaking motion. And you can see how that comes through in the two with the two exposures in this particular image. But color is something that's really important also. So a shop door with a lot of colorful signage, the image on the right or on the left, and then the image on the right is actually just a piece of wall art that was hanging in a place that I was staying. So playing around, I think I probably spent an hour just playing with this one wall hanging that was creating all of these different kinds of effects. And dark blend mode is something that I really like to work with because it does create oftentimes these very painterly kinds of effects and images. But this one is bright blend mode, and this is just a natural world image where I've used a vertical motion and a horizontal motion to create this effect with trees and grasses. And so this type 2 that I mentioned, the high frame rate, again, where I'm moving the camera rapidly through a scene and clicking off and firing off the exposures as I move the camera through the scene. That's what this next series of images are going to be. And I like working with average blend mode when I do this high frame rate a lot of times. And I do like this technique in urban environments as well, because it does help to bring, show the vibrancy and the energy of the urban environment. This is just local to me in Iowa City. Again, just moving the camera around and through the scene. If I'd used bright blend mode or dark blend mode, I would get a completely different look. And I'll show you a couple of high frame rate images where I have used bright and dark blend mode. But these two images, again, are average blend mode, 9 exposures for the one on the left and 5 to 6 exposures with the one on the right. And this is also doing some zooming while I'm clicking through the high frame rate multiple exposures. So I might have done, 2 or 3 zooms while I clicked off the rest of the exposures. And you can see how that's coming through in those curved lines that are you can see in these two images. But again, just showing the essence and the vibrancy and the energy of these particular scenes. This is using bright blend mode, and this is using 4 to 5 exposures, high frame rate, clicking 4 or 5 times around this scene. And you can see how the blending with bright blend mode is much different. You get a completely different kind of effect than you get here. If I'd used bright blend mode, say for this image on the right here, you would have gotten more of this kind of overlapping and interweaving of whites like you do in this particular image with the clouds. You would have seen more of that in this area here. So, average blend mode is going to give you a much different look and feel compared to bright and dark blend mode. And you can study these again if you download the PDF. And this is using dark blend mode, 4 to 5 exposures. And again, you can can see that there is a difference, a very striking difference between the effect that you get when you're using dark blend mode compared to when you're using bright blend mode and when you're using average blend mode. But, you know, they're all very creative and all very artistic, and there's nothing to say that one is better or worse than the other. And I always do use all of the different blend modes. I have preferences sometimes, but I do like to work with average blend mode a lot of times, most of the time when I'm in urban environments, but I do play around with bright and dark blend mode as well in urban environments when I'm doing that high frame rate, because you just never know what you're going to get. And so playing with the different techniques and the different blending modes is really, really important, because if you don't ever try, you won't know. And so I always at least try. So this is using bright blend mode, high frame rate in a natural environment, which was a very big sky, a desert environment in Santa Fe. This is at Ghost Ranch. But the bright blend mode helped to really capitalize on those big puffy white clouds and create this very dramatic effect with this particular image. And the thing too about bright blend mode and dark blend mode as well is that oftentimes in the blending, where all of those highlights are coming together, you can get the creation of some colors that don't actually exist in the natural scene. So you see here, there's some purples and some pinks that don't really exist in the natural scene. That's all part of the blending process with bright blend mode. With dark blend mode, if I had been in dark blend mode, then I probably would have seen more fluorescent yellows and greens and those kinds of things. And then this is just a woodland area in the autumn. There were a lot of these red flowers, I think Indian paintbrushes or something. But in working with this high frame rate and moving around using dark blend mode to create this image, it felt like I was painting this scene. It felt like my camera was my brush, and it looks like brush strokes. And so that's something else that's really exciting for me with all of this, is that it makes me feel like I'm painting with my camera, and I like those painterly effects that I get. So I'll talk a little bit about mobile ICMs. I know we're getting close to the 1 hour mark, but I do want to talk about mobile ICMs really quickly, and then I want to show you some before and after images to show what some scenes look like before and after. If you're an Android user, the best app that I have found to use with the Android device is this Camera FV5 app. And I am an Android user, and this is the app that I use with my Android device to do ICM with my mobile device. You know, a lot of people are coming to ICM these days through their mobile devices. And so unfortunately, Android seems to be a little behind the iPhones and all of the creative apps that the iPhones have. But this Camera FV5 does create some images that I like, and I have tried working with both the native camera in the Android and the Lightroom mobile camera, and I like the effect that I get with this Camera FV5. Not to mention, I'm able to control the exposure a lot better. When I work with the native camera trying to extend the shutter speed, I don't have the ability to really control the exposure, so I get a lot of blowouts, and I don't know exactly why that happens, that I can get images without a lot of blowout with the Camera FV5 as opposed to, you know, the native camera. But the other thing too that you'll notice is that these look like those high frame rate images that I just showed you that I do with my DSLR. They have that kind of look and feel like high frame rate. And so these are both something like this. I'm just doing something like moving or toggling or paddling with the camera. So I do all kinds of things like this with my mobile device. And the thing with the mobile cameras is that the shutter doesn't stay open for, say, a half a second or 1 second, however long you have the shutter speed set for. The camera is actually firing off rapidly multiple exposures. So that's why you get that effect that looks like that high frame rate technique, because it is essentially multiple exposures, high frame rate, multiple exposures, moving the camera through the scene. So these are some examples of that. There is now this option, and it's probably been around for a while, but I only just learned of it recently with the Samsung Galaxy models. I don't know if it's on all Androids or if it's just specific to Samsung, but if you go into your native camera app and go to the more, you can find this Expert RAW option, and it allows you to go to multiple exposure mode, and you can use additive, average, bright, and dark blend mode with your mobile device. I have tried this with doing ICM for each of the exposures, and I haven't had a lot of luck with getting anything that I was happy with. I have seen someone in one of the presentations I gave recently, he did 2 straight exposures using this right while I was talking, and then showed the image, and the straight images without ICM. I liked what he created, but when I've done it with myself with moving the camera, I haven't necessarily liked the results. So it's something that I will need to play around with, but I wanted you to at least be aware that that's also an option. So I did actually add an iPhone to my mobile plan back in October, because the iPhone has much more creative apps and the cameras are really, really good. And I wanted to be able to do multiple exposure with a mobile device. I wanted to have that ability to play in that way. This was longer before I learned about this option with the Android. And so with Slow Shutter Cam app, you can do multiple exposure ICMs. You can do single exposure ICMs, and these are the options that you would have. Motion blur is something similar. The results you get with motion blur are something similar to like average blend mode. Light trail results are going to be more like bright blend mode, and low light are going to be results more like dark blend mode if you use these different capture modes with Slow Shutter Cam. And so essentially with the Slow Shutter Cam app, if you wanted to, you could, these are both single exposure ICMs here, and you can see again how it's got that digital look because of the way the camera is firing off rapidly to create the image. I want to open up my phone so I can show you. So these are both single exposures, no editing done on either of these, but these images are multiple exposure ICMs, where I have essentially moved the camera vertically for one exposure and horizontally for one exposure. So when you open up the Slow Shutter Cam app, you can you press the shutter button, you take your exposure, doing a horizontal movement if you want, and then it gives you the option to clear, edit, or save. And as long as you don't clear the image, you can save it. So I could save it and it'll save that single exposure that I just took. But as long as I don't clear it, it keeps that image on the screen, and then I can do a vertical motion and take a second exposure on top of that. So you can do that however many times you want to create however many exposures for your multiple exposures. So some people don't realize you can do that with Slow Shutter Cam app, and so I always like to explain that. And then these are just a couple more examples of the multiple exposure. Both these, I think, using light trails, and you can see here again this, because this is the light trails and it's similar to bright blend mode, it's creating some pinks and colors that don't exist in the natural environment. The other app I like to use is Average Cam Pro, and that is enables you to take up to 128 exposures if you want. I like to work with about 8, and so essentially what happens when I'm in the Average Cam Pro app is I press the button to start the shutter, I press the shutter button to start the exposure, and then it counts down, and I move the camera and I can see it unfolding on the screen. And so I can place the camera where I want to build these images in an artistic way. And so these are just some examples using the Average Cam Pro app. I also, in my post-processing workflow, when I'm doing these mobile ICMs, whether that's with the iPhone or with the Android, I sometimes like to bring the clarity all the way down, -100, to help soften some of that digital look and feel because of the multiple exposures that they're firing off. So some before and after examples. I just wanted to run through a series of slides to show what some of the scenes look like before. And I'll talk a little bit about some things that caught my attention or that are adding some visual interest. That, like for this image here, there's some little areas of ice and snow on the sand bar here. This is the next to the river, or on the water itself. And those pockets of ice and snow are helping to bring in some textural elements. You probably wouldn't even think twice about those things if you were out there. You might, not really be conscious of those little details when you're out working with your camera, but they help to bring in some visual interest, add some textural elements in your images. So I feel like ICM has helped to teach me to see things that I might not have noticed before. This particular scene, I composed it below the tree line so that the bluff on the opposite side of the river was in shadow. There was a really strong sunlight reflecting on the river here, so I had to underexpose so that I didn't blow out those highlights. And then in post-processing, I brought up those shadows using a linear gradient, and that helped to reveal some of that light that was being dragged into the frame, because that's one of the beauties of ICM, is that it's dragging light and it's dragging color into and across the frame of your images in a lot of cases. This is that before this is that image we saw earlier, the ICM, the impressionistic tree image, where I was doing the shaking, and that's what that particular scene looked like before. I mean, it's not a bad scene necessarily. It's just that the ICM helps soften the feel of it and gives it a more impressionistic look. This is using the multiple exposure technique, where I flipped the camera upside down for the second exposure. You can see that these columns are very colorful on the right-hand side and only red on the left-hand side. But by flipping the camera upside down, I was able to bring that color from the colorful side of the columns into both sides. And then, because it is a walkway, a covered walkway, I've created some depth with that multiple exposure ICM, some depth that draws you into that walkway in a unique way. We saw this image earlier. These are those grasses, those tall grasses, and that's what that scene looks like. And this is a field of grasses that I go to quite often, all throughout the year, different times of the year. This is that same field of grasses, but just getting up close to the grasses and playing with the tops of them using a diagonal movement. And I love that combination of those yellows and whites and baby blue colors together. And then this is that same field of grasses, but in the wintertime, and there's this big pile of dirt, and I thought, well, what can I do with that? Can I use that to incorporate in the ICM to create something different? And just by doing that twisting motion, I was able to create what felt like kind of a mountain rising up out of the snow, and all of these little footprints and snowmobile tracks and things like that, and the snow helped to add a textural element that wouldn't be there without those. So that again is something that helps to add some visual interest. This is a sunset where over land, and then by flipping the camera upside down for the second exposure, that helps to bring in that sky into the top and the bottom of the frame. This is icicles on the side of a limestone bluff. Not necessarily a very picturesque or, attractive scene in and of itself, but playing with multiple exposure and ICM, what caught my attention was the way the light was reflecting off of those icicles. So playing around with multiple exposure ICMs to create something unique and different. A door with graffiti and some peeling paint on I guess it was just some stairs up a, I don't know what you would call it. This was in San Miguel in Mexico. And so just stopping to play with that door, I liked the contrast between the blue paint and the brown paint, and then the color of the door. And so playing around to see what I could create with that, something artistic. And then these next slides are going to show the before scene and the after ICM, but kind of just putting a box around the area that I was focusing on, because oftentimes I'm, in a big landscape maybe, or I might be in a big scene, but I don't always necessarily, take ICM of that big scene or of that whole scene. I might just work with a particular area in that particular scene. And so this is an image of what drew my attention was these red leaves that were starting to turn already, while all the rest of the leaves were still green, and the light that was hitting that particular area of these trees. This is playing with the reflecting light off of this waterfall next to a grist mill, and big scene, bright skies, bright afternoon. It was probably 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But by focusing on that area right there and not including any sky in the scene, I'm able to work with just my 3-stop ND filter, my 70 to 200 millimeter lens, and going up to f32 and being fine with my exposure on that. This particular scene, again, what caught my attention was the contrast between the way the light was falling on these leaves and these ferns and the shadow behind all of that. Again, working with multiple exposure ICM. And then this is another big scene. This is Chimney Rock at Ghost Ranch in Santa Fe, and just playing around with that area right there. What can I create? Turning the camera upside down helped me create a scene that feels like Chimney Rock is floating in air, or it's rising up out of the sky. Working with just a small part of a waterfall, a very small waterfall of a river here to create a unique and interesting image with that. And then this scene here, the light was reflecting on these orange flowers that are hanging over this street. And I just working with bright blend mode helped to enhance some of those colors and introduce some new colors that didn't necessarily exist to create something really abstract and painterly. And then again, another one of those situations where I was drawn to the contrast between the highlights and the shadows, working with the way the light is reflecting on the river and the very dark area behind or on the opposite side of the river to bring in that contrast, to work with that contrast between those highlights and those shadows. And then a couple of mobile ICM before and after. I loved the way the light was coming into this particular scene. This is the Design Museum in London, and beautiful architecture, beautiful light, beautiful colors, playing around with my mobile device with camera FV5 for the Android. And then this is Average Cam Pro in Scotland, in the Highlands of Scotland, playing around with the mobile device. And, you know, I did have my DSLR for this particular, well, all of these images, even this one, I worked with my DSLR, and I worked with my DSLR here, and also for this one here. And I played around with both the mobile device and the DSLR. And sometimes I do find that the images I get with my mobile device are the ones that resonate with me more so than the ones I create with my DSLR. So you always have your mobile device with you. So don't discount it as a tool for being able to play and be creative at any given time. So just a few things to keep in mind as we wrap things up about ICM is that, you know, there are no rules with ICM. It enables us to break free of the things we've previously learned about photography. You don't need to use a tripod. You certainly can use one if you'd like, but I always like to encourage people to handhold, freestyle it, get comfortable moving and playing. I feel like if you're on a tripod, you're not going to be able to move like you would be able to if you had it off the tripod and you were just free with your movements. You saw in the video how free I am with my movements. And I think that's really, really important. It can be difficult, and you can be a little self-conscious early on by doing that, because people do look at you strangely oftentimes. But if you can just get past that stage to a point where it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks, you're just getting in the flow, you get into the creative flow, and that's all that really matters. I think you'll be much happier trying to play with ICM hand holding than being on a tripod. And again, there's no right or wrong way to do ICM. The key really is to have fun and explore, experiment, play, try new things, try things that, you know, you may not have ever tried before. And if you can think of a way to move the camera, try it and see what happens. And just do a lot of work. You know, I think a lot of people end up giving up on ICM too soon because they're not giving it enough time and attention. They're not getting something that they like after a few shots, and then they just think, okay, well, it's just not for me, so I'm going to move on. But you literally oftentimes have to shoot dozens or hundreds of exposures in any particular scene. I have 250,000 frames of ICM in my Lightroom catalog, and in any particular outing, when I'm out with my camera, I can shoot anywhere from 100, 200, 500 exposures. And, you know, do I need all of those exposures? Maybe not. Maybe I might only have 1 or 2 out of 500 that I actually like, but it's all part of the process. It's all part of helping you grow and evolve and understand how to work with your camera in this way. And so I feel like it's invaluable to shoot lots and lots and lots of frames. Because the more you do it, you know, the more you're going to understand how the different types of movement create different effects, how different sizes and speeds of movements, how settings are going to have an effect on the end result. And then that combination of all of those factors, because there's an infinite number of combinations actually. And so the only way to really get to grips with it all, I think, is to do a lot of work. The magazine, I started ICM Photography magazine 4 years ago, and it's been a passion project for me. I've been able to work with about more than 200 photographers, probably more than 250 by this point, from around the world, all of whom are doing ICM and using creative photography techniques. So it's a project that I'm really proud of, and I pay everyone for their work. I pay everyone for their content, which is something else I'm proud of, because a lot of times people these days are asked to give their content away for free or for only the promise of, or the payment of exposure. And so it's been very important to me to pay people for their content from the very beginning. It's an advertisement-free magazine, and I have no sponsors. And so it's a very grassroots effort. It's readers supported, and there was something I was going to say about it, but I forgot now what that was. I teach in person and online workshops, and I do have a workshop coming up in Santa Fe, New Mexico in June, and there are still a few openings. If you'd like to travel to Santa Fe this summer, I'd love to have you come and join me. We'll be doing multiple exposure, single exposure, and mobile ICMs, and I'm also going to talk about doing some creative layering of ICMs in Photoshop in this workshop also. So if you're looking to go somewhere this summer and you want to have an ICM adventure, come and join me in Santa Fe. This is my website. You can click on any of these links if you download the presentation, and it will open all of the links up in an internet browser. And then these are some of the ways that you can connect with me on social media, my website, and that is the end of my presentation. So there were no questions in the chat, so I hope I didn't put everybody to sleep.
Stephanie, thank you. Thank you for an interesting.
Oh, you cut out. Well, I'm happy to answer any questions. I think.
Do you have people walk up to you and say, don't you know how to hold a camera still, or anything like that? What's the oddest thing that somebody said to you when you're out in a city?
Yeah, I mean, I think you broke up there for a second, so I don't know if I heard all of what you just said, but yeah, I mean, I don't know that anyone's ever really said anything to me specifically, but I do know people who do ICM that say a lot, that people come up to them and say, it would work better if you held the camera still or something like that. Yeah.
And how long did it take you to make the transition from being a landscape photographer to being an ICM photographer? How about it? You're obviously accomplished, so how long did that take you to make that change?
I think, I first started working with ICM in the summer of 2017. So 2017 was when I first started seeing it and I first started playing with it. And by 2018, probably I'd say about a year later, I had decided I'm fully invested in this. I'm going to go out and I'm going to spend as much time as I can working with ICM only. And so, it was a transition, probably 6 to 8 months. And then by a year later, it was something I was doing fully. I don't travel with a tripod anymore. I don't go with any intentions to go shoot traditional landscapes anymore. Because, we've all seen everything before, traditional landscapes. And the thing I want to communicate with my images, I guess now is my own take on a particular scene. So even if I go to an iconic landscape, I'm always looking to create something that you haven't seen before, or I haven't seen before. So Jerry just asked if I use an ND filter. I do use a 3-stop ND filter, but I never say that you have to have an ND filter to do ICM. There are photographers out there that will say, oh, you have to have an ND to do ICM. But the first 3 years I did ICM, I didn't use a filter at all. So you certainly can use you can do ICM without a filter. My thing is I always want to encourage people that if you go out and you don't have an ND filter and you're pointing the camera in a direction that you can't get a slow enough shutter speed, just turn and look for something that is going to give you that ability to achieve a slow shutter speed. So find a way to work with whatever gear you have, or whatever conditions, or whatever lighting is in front of you, I think is really, really more important than worrying about the right conditions or the right gear or the right light. So that's my spiel on that. But I do use the ND filter now because I feel like it helps enhance the colors that I get. So I don't use it to control the light necessarily. I just feel like it helps enhance the colors. How much time and effort do you take on post-processing in any image compared to taking the image? Well, I mean, the images take half a second to make, and then I spend however, I mean, I don't do a lot of post-processing on my images. I'm shooting in RAW, so of course I'm going to need to do some editing. I don't necessarily time it, but I'm, working on things like contrast and exposure, highlights and shadows. Highlights and shadows are probably the first two things that I play with the sliders on, because I'm either underexposing a lot of time, so I need to bring up the shadows, and I'm also often shooting at something really, really bright, so I'm having to work with those highlights, bring the highlights down, and then just making adjustments from there. And then I take the biggest time I spend on post-processing really is the spot removal. So I do all of my edits in Lightroom, and then I take my images into Photoshop and I use the spot healing brush tool to remove the spots. Because I'm often shooting at a very high aperture like f32 at maybe say 200 millimeters, that magnifies all the spots. Even if you clean your lens and your sensor every single day, you're always going to have spots with ICM. And so they're going to be much more noticeable if you're shooting at higher apertures and higher, longer focal lengths than you would if you were at, say, f4 and 24 millimeters. So that's where I spend the most of my time, is removing spots.
It's Jean. I have learned so much tonight. I just didn't realize the possibilities for all of this. It's wonderful. I mean, I've tried with flowers and some trees, but you've shed new light on ordinary subjects that will help me learn and do a better job myself.
Oh, great. Well, yeah, I think, ICM can be done with anything, any subject. I know people who create beautiful images with just things inside their own home. So you don't even have to go out anywhere. You can create using knickknacks on a shelf or paintings or wall hangings. So yeah, I think the key really is just start moving and see what happens, and then go from there.
Does anyone else have any questions for Stephanie this evening?
I think maybe you answered a lot of them during your presentation.
I have a question. This is Janine.
Yeah.
It's just based on everything you've said about movement, and just when you just said just get out and start moving. To what extent do you think that act of actually physically moving leads to your type of creativity, or leads to creativity in general, actually physically moving?
I think it's huge. I think it's a huge thing. It's a huge part of it, because I think if you don't just get out and start moving, if you just get stuck in your head thinking, well, would it work if I did this, or would it work if I did that, and you don't actually move, you're never going to know. And so just starting to move, and sometimes you're not even going to know until you start moving what, you're going to go in directions you can't even possibly imagine until you start moving. A lot of times I'll just start moving and playing, see what's happening. And then as I see what's happening, then I realize, oh, this thing here, I really like that. Maybe I can do more with that. And then I will push myself to go further with that. But I wouldn't have even thought of that maybe until I started to see what was happening. So I think moving, just getting out and starting to move, is a huge part of it. And don't be afraid or timid or self-conscious about it, because you know, if you don't try, you'll never know. And it's really important to just try, I think. So,
Yeah, I agree.
Bruce, did you have anything else to add to tonight's
No,
meeting?
if there are no more questions for Stephanie, again, thank you for a very interesting presentation this evening. As I said, our next presentation will be June 19th on how to make prints. And in the meantime, we hope to see you all in the Cuyahoga Valley. Again, thanks a lot, Stephanie. Thank you all for attending tonight.
oh, thank you so much.
Stephanie,
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
wonderful.
All right. Have a
Thank
good
you so
evening,
much.
everyone.
Thank you.